It was supposed to be a quiet dinner. No headlines. No press. Just two former officials, catching up after a long week, seated at a corner table in a restaurant where no one should have cared who they were. But by the end of the night, Kash Patel and Karoline Leavitt would be standing outside in the cold, unserved, unwelcome, and silently watched by a room full of strangers. Not because of what they said, not because of what they did, but because someone recognized them and decided that was reason enough. What happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't loud. It wasn't defiant. But it was unforgettable. And the quiet way they responded would leave everyone who witnessed it rethinking what it means to carry dignity into a room that doesn't want you there. Before we walk through everything that unfolded, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. Because this story isn't just about politics. It's about poise, and how sometimes the most powerful form of protest is restraint. The night started with a text. Kash was in New Hampshire for 2 days of meetings. Karoline, who had recently wrapped a speaking engagement nearby, agreed to meet for dinner before he flew out. They picked a small, historic restaurant, known for its wine list, stone walls, and no-nonsense policy on press and cameras. They chose it because it was quiet. That would prove ironic. According to reservation logs, they were booked under Patel's name. The staff confirmed their table, noted the arrival time, and made no mention of the guests' identities to the manager. Until they walked in. Karoline arrived first, alone, dressed simply in black. She greeted the host with a polite smile. Moments later, Kash stepped through the door. They shook hands, exchanged a few quiet words, and followed the host to their table. Several diners recognized them. No one said anything. But one guest, seated near the entrance, pulled out a phone and began typing. A server would later confirm that within minutes, the general manager was called to the front. He didn't say much, just took one look across the dining room, saw who was sitting in the corner booth, and walked over. What happened next was seen by every single person in the restaurant. The manager didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask any questions. He stood at the edge of the table and said, "You two are not welcome here." Kash looked up, startled. "Excuse me. You'll have to leave," the manager said flatly. "We reserve the right to refuse service. That's what we're doing." Karoline sat still. Kash replied, "We have a reservation. We've done nothing but sit down." "You're not welcome," the manager repeated. Karoline spoke next. Calmly, "Can you explain why?" The manager folded his arms. "We know who you are, and we know what you stand for." The dining room went silent. Forks paused midair. Conversation stopped. Even the clink of glasses faded. The air had shifted. Karoline said nothing. Kash didn't move. Then Kash asked a question. Quiet, simple. "Do you treat all your guests this way? Or just the ones with names you don't like?" The manager stared at him, unblinking. "This isn't political. It's personal." The sentence hung in the air. It wasn't meant to be said out loud. And yet, it had been. Kash reached for his coat. Karoline reached for her bag. Neither raised their voice. Neither demanded a manager above the manager. Neither mentioned lawsuits, platforms, or consequences. Instead, Karoline stood and said, "Thank you for making it clear. That makes this easier." Kash left a folded bill on the table. The server had never even brought water. And as they turned to leave, Karoline looked toward the staff still standing near the kitchen. "This isn't about you," she said softly. "You don't have to carry this." "He does." And they walked out. The door shut behind them with a quiet finality. But the moment didn't stay inside that restaurant. Because one diner, seated near the window, had recorded the last 30 seconds. No commentary. No editing. Just the moment two public figures stood, straightened their coats, and walked out of a place that had already made up its mind about them. The video was uploaded later that night. By morning, it had been viewed more than 2 million times. And by the afternoon, the story had shifted from private discomfort to national conversation. But Kash and Karoline didn't comment. Not yet. Because what they were already planning had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with reminding people what real leadership looks like when no one expects it. By sunrise, the video had already made the rounds. The footage wasn't dramatic. It wasn't edited for effect. It showed no confrontation, no shouting, no protest. Just two people calmly gathering their belongings and walking out of a restaurant that had decided, without explanation, they didn't deserve a seat at the table. And that's why it struck a nerve. Because in a cultural moment so saturated with conflict, what Kash Patel and Karoline Leavitt did, or more precisely, what they didn't do, became the story. The clip was viewed nearly 4 million times in its first 24 hours. It was shared by supporters and critics alike. But no matter who posted it, the takeaway remained the same. They were calm. They didn't make a scene. They didn't weaponize the moment. They just left, with dignity intact. By noon, news outlets had started calling. Cable panels began debating whether refusing service to a guest for their politics was ethical. Some tried to reduce the moment to strategy. Others tried to ignite outrage. But none of it stuck. Because Kash and Karoline weren't playing along. They declined interviews. They issued no statements. They didn't name the restaurant. They didn't call for backlash. Instead, they made a phone call of their own to a small shelter on the other side of town. The shelter had recently lost funding for its weekly meal program. For months, they'd been struggling to feed just 40 people a night. When Karoline asked what it would take to cover the next month, the director gave her a number. She doubled it. And then Kash asked if they could volunteer the next evening. No cameras. No hashtags. No campaign press. Just work. That night, they showed up in jeans and sweatshirts. They filled plates, cleaned tables, sat with veterans, spoke with families. They didn't bring a message. They didn't post about it later. But someone else did. A volunteer at the shelter took a single photo, the two of them standing behind the counter, gloves on, heads down, plating food. She posted it with one caption. They got kicked out of a restaurant last night. Tonight they're serving meals to people who don't care about politics, just kindness. The photo exploded, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. Within hours, other local charities began receiving anonymous donations. One community center received enough funding to upgrade its winter coat drive for underprivileged kids. Another saw its Friday meal line double because word had spread that people who care had shown up. Still, Kash and Karoline stayed silent. But not because they were avoiding the moment, because they were shaping it. And the longer they said nothing, the louder the public response became. Comments poured in. I don't care what side you're on. That's how you handle disrespect. She didn't throw a fit. He didn't demand headlines. They just got to work. This is what leadership without ego looks like. The restaurant, meanwhile, had said nothing. No statement. No comment. But the impact was visible. Tables sat empty during lunch service. Reviews were locked. Local suppliers reportedly began requesting written clarification of the business's guest policy before renewing contracts. Then came the letter, published anonymously, verified by a member of the kitchen staff. We watched them get treated like a problem. We watched them stay calm. And then we watched our manager pretend nothing happened. A few of us don't want to work for a place where dignity gets ignored, no matter who's sitting at the table. The note ended simply. They showed more grace in leaving than we've ever seen from anyone staying. Still, neither Kash nor Karoline responded publicly, until a small-town paper requested a quote for a local community profile, not about the restaurant, but about the shelter. Karoline agreed. The reporter asked if she had anything to say about the viral moment. She paused, then answered, We weren't there to be symbols. We just wanted dinner. But when someone tells you you don't belong, you have two choices. You can push your way in, or you can go somewhere else and make sure someone else feels welcome there. The quote ran in 3 papers. Then it ran across the country. Because the story had stopped being about who they were. It had become about how they handled it. It had been 6 days since the restaurant incident. The video had faded from trending lists. The news cycle had moved on. But something deeper had taken hold in the town, and far beyond it. Not because the moment had been loud, but because it hadn't. What Kash Patel and Karoline Leavitt chose to do in the days that followed, staying quiet, serving others, saying no to spectacle, had done what no soundbite ever could. It had made people reflect about how we treat each other, about what dignity actually looks like when no one is watching. And just when everyone assumed the story had run its course, it didn't end. It evolved. That Sunday, the shelter where they had volunteered received an anonymous donation. Enough to keep the doors open through winter. No name, no note, just a quiet wire transfer routed through 3 channels. The staff knew where it came from. And while they were still processing that news, a local church received a message. Kash and Karoline would be attending Sunday service, seated with the community, no press allowed. Just worship. They didn't speak. They didn't sit in the front. They didn't take the podium. They sang. They prayed. They shook hands with families and whispered blessings to children. And as the congregation filed out, Karoline was overheard saying something that would later appear in the church bulletin. People talk about values, but values are what you choose when you've been given every reason not to live by them. That same evening, as the sun set over the quiet downtown, something happened that no one expected. The restaurant door opened, and Kash Patel walked in. Not in protest, not in defiance. He wore no camera. He brought no audience. Just himself. The hostess recognized him immediately. She froze. But before she could say anything, Kash smiled gently. "I'm not here to eat," he said. "I'm here to speak with your manager. Just for a moment." The manager came out slowly. Same man. Same look of caution. This time, Kash extended his hand first. "Thank you," he said. The manager looked stunned. "For what?" he asked. "For giving me the chance," Kash replied. "To show people who I really am." The manager didn't respond, but the gesture had already landed. Kash continued, "I'm not here to shame you. I've done nothing this week that wasn't mine to do. But I want you to know I don't carry this moment with anger. And I don't need you to explain anything." A pause. "I just want you to know I forgive you." The staff behind the counter went completely still, and the manager, unable to meet his eyes for more than a second, nodded and said only, "I wasn't expecting that." Kash smiled. No one ever does. And then he left. That moment wasn't recorded. But it didn't need to be. Because what followed was unmistakable. 3 employees from the restaurant quit over the next week. Not in protest, but in principle. One wrote an open letter on social media. "We watched him walk in again. Alone. And offer forgiveness to a place that never asked for it. I've worked in service for 12 years. I've never seen anything that quietly powerful." The restaurant, now under new management, later posted a small sign in their window. "We've learned from what happened here. From those who left. And from those who walked back in." And that's where the story could have ended. But it didn't. Because a month later, at a community event for small businesses, the 2 people at the center of it all, Kash and Karoline, were spotted in the crowd. No spotlight. No announcement. Just walking booth to booth, shaking hands, supporting vendors, and helping one local bakery sell out of cookies for the first time all year. When asked by a volunteer why they came back to the same block where they'd once been turned away, Karoline smiled and said, "Because the only way to change the tone is to keep showing up." The volunteer nodded. Then Kash added one final line. "And when you do, eventually the room changes with you." And it had. Not through outrage, not through revenge, but through quiet courage, consistent grace, and the kind of strength that doesn't need attention, because it never sought it in the first place. And that's what people remembered. Not the insult, not the exit, but the way they walked back in.